Alright, so let's start looking at how we can determine the probability of what traits are going to get passed on. Okay, as far as probability goes, that's just figuring out how many times within a given number will you get a certain event that will occur. You can calculate it using this formula. Not too worried about you using the formula, but it is here so you know how to use it. Let's actually get to how we can predict probability. We're going to use these monohybrid crosses. You've seen these before, okay, in previous years, but let's revisit them real quickly before we start using them, these Punnett squares, okay? Mono meaning one, hybrid cross, which means a hybrid is anything that's produced when you cross two organisms. A hybrid is going to have certain traits of one organism and certain traits of another. So what we're looking at is we're going to try to use a Punnett square to determine the possible offspring when we cross two organisms, determine the possible genetics of that offspring for one trait. Okay, so we're looking at one trait when we do this. So for example, if we if we had two rabbits, one with white fur, one with brown fur, okay? We know the rabbits are heterozygous for fur color. Okay, remember heterozygous means they carry a dominant allele and a recessive allele for fur color. Okay, so big A, little a. Big A being the dominant color or dominant gene or dominant allele, lowercase a being the recessive allele. So they're heterozygous for both. They're both heterozygous for fur color. Okay, here's how it would work. You have your Punnett square. We put the genotype, the genetic trait on each side. So we have big A, little a for one parent, big A, little a for the other parent. The big A is going to be for white fur, which means it is dominant over brown fur, which is the recessive trait. When you cross them, you have 1 in 4 chance of producing a homozygous white furred rabbit. You have a 50% chance to produce a heterozygous white furred rabbit. And then you have a 1 in 4 chance of producing a brown fur rabbit. Okay? That would be the phenotype. So we just named what the physical color of the rabbit fur would be. Now if you look at genotype, 1 in 4 chance of producing homozygous white fur, 50% chance of producing heterozygous, and then 1 in 4 chance of producing homozygous brown fur. So when we throw in the word homozygous or heterozygous, we're also including genotype. So this is going to give us a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Okay, 1 in 4 chance of the homozygous dominant, 2 out of 4 chance of the heterozygous, and then 1 in 4 chance of the homozygous recessive. All right, so let's practice a little bit. Let's cross homozygous dominant female with a homozygous recessive male using the same traits. So homozygous dominant would be big A, big A. Homozygous recessive would be little a, little a. The first box we would get heterozygous. The second box we would get heterozygous. The third box, heterozygous, and then the last box would be heterozygous. So our overall probability would be if we crossed homozygous dominant female and a heterozygous recessive male, that every offspring would have white fur, but they would all be heterozygous. So the genotype ratio would be 1, 2, 3, 4 to 1, or 100%. Okay, 4 to nothing, so 100%. And then the phenotype ratio, it would be 100% white fur. So now let's look at crossing a homozygous dominant female with a heterozygous male. So homozygous dominant female would be big A, big A. Heterozygous male would be big A, little a. First box, we would get homozygous dominant. Second box, we would get homozygous dominant. third box we would get heterozygous, fourth box heterozygous. So a little bit different in the probability for these two. So our genotype ratio would be 2 to 2, or 50%. Then the phenotype ratio would be all 4 would still be white fur. Just 2 would be homozygous dominant for the white fur, and 2 would be heterozygous. Now this is used in a lot of different fields, okay? Dog breeding, florists that want to produce flowers of particular colors so they can sell them. Right? It's very important to know these genotypical traits, whether an organism is homozygous for a particular trait or heterozygous for a particular trait, because you're looking for specific outcomes. So let's try this. If we know one but not necessarily the other, is this purple flower, is it homozygous for the purple color, or is it heterozygous for the purple color? So what you would do is, if you have a known organism, you cross it with the unknown to figure out the traits. Okay, so we know that white flowers are going to be homozygous recessive. We don't know if this purple flower is homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So we can cross them and see. So we set up a Punnett square, 2 possible outcomes. If the purple flower is heterozygous, okay, these would be the probabilities of the organisms for the offspring. If the purple flower was homozygous dominant, then these would be the probabilities. If you look at this one, all of the offspring would be purple. For this one, if you cross the purple and the white flower and some of them come out white, then you know that your purple flower is heterozygous. So these are ways that you can determine the genotype of an organism if it's unknown, but you have one that is known, that you know the results of another one.